This line of thinking makes a mockery of not just the sacrament of confession, but it makes a mockery of Father Anthony Gerber, the priest who wrote the original article, and every priest is a true shepherd who cares about his flock and wants more people into the confessional so that he can help save the sick and ailing sheep. This is Mike from Catholic Treehouse. I'd like to welcome you to episode 58 of the Saint in Progress podcast, your source for inspiration, information, and directions for your soul's journey back home to the Father's house. So last week I talked about calling a professional, the need to call a professional sometimes in our lives. And one of the things I mentioned was about going to confession. Well, wouldn't you know it, earlier this week, Substack presented a great post from Father Anthony Gerber on the topic of why your kids don't go to confession. And man, it was not just eye-opening, but convicting. Totally right on the money, and I think it speaks to many adult Catholics as well. I know it spoke to me before I had the conversion of heart about why and when I went to confession. And so it's really, really worth reading. And I'm going to go ahead and, in addition to restacking, which I've already done, I'm going to link to it in the show notes because it's a fabulous, fabulous read. But the general gist is that if we turn confession into something that you do because, oh, it's Lent and we need to get to confession, rather than, oh, I sinned, I've offended God, I need to get to confession, that confession becomes something that isn't tied to the heart, but rather tied to an event or a time frame. So it was a really great post, and I'd like to thank Father Gerber for putting this out there because it's just really a great piece. So the whole article is something that my wife and I are going to have to discuss and dig into making some changes with our own daughters, but it also serves as a springboard for this episode. So let me set everything up with a bit of a look backwards. Let's set the Wayback Machine to episode number 3 of this show entitled Our Handicapped Life. And I talked about original sin and the effects of original sin, and I listed 3 ways that we lie to ourselves about ourselves. Okay, we have an infinite capacity for self-delusion. That's number 1. Number 2, we give ourselves points for good intentions. And number 3, we have a resistance to legitimate authority. And that episode, I also talked about the fact that because our emotions and reason are out of order, our understanding of truth is distorted, and that we don't understand the truth about God, the truth about ourselves, and the truth about other people. Now, with that in mind, and if you need to go back and hit pause on this one and go back and listen to episode number 3 again, but with that in mind, let's go to the comments section of the piece by Father Anthony Gerber, and let me remind you that it was written by a priest who obviously wants more people in the confessional. And let's look at one commentator, what they had to say. And their account name was Another Anon. Well, they're wanting to be anonymous, and if they are a Catholic, they represent a bad and, dare I say, nearly Protestant mindset about confession. I think it's a good illustration of how we lie to ourselves about ourselves, and how we lie to ourselves about thinking that we understand other people and their motivations. So here is what Another Anon has to say about what the priest wrote. You and your brother priests are in a position to answer this, but how much of your limited time is spent absolving venial sins? How many of your confessions on average were strictly necessary in a technical theological sense? Or rather, how many have been resolved with a Confiteor or even an Our Father in some spiritual direction? Unfortunately, confession is often being used as a measure for devoutness rather than what is a measure of sin. It's not good that faithful congregations frequent confession as if it were a therapy office. I wince every time a Catholic attempts to measure the length of a penitential line as if it were some measure of something good. It suggests that the culture isn't trying to walk the walk, and, or worse, they don't trust that most forgiveness is available just for the asking. There are no penitential lines in heaven, and that's what we're aiming for right now. If I may add a personal observation, it appears that confession is also a sacrament that exhausts our priests the most. By its nature, it's personal. I don't see how encouraging unnecessary confessions helps the situation of limited personal emotional resources and time for our overworked priests. Maybe the solution to the dots problem is not asking everyone to take unnecessary trips to begin with. Maybe the time is better spent on regular education on what is a sin and what is not a sin, and how to make a good confession for mortal sins, and how to track one down as needed. That might help a great deal more than getting parents to fix the trip to Abilene problem. Okay, if you don't know, the commenter is referring to something called the Abilene Paradox, which is where a group of people decide together to take a long and uncomfortable road trip to Abilene because they think that everybody else wants to go and they want to go along with the group, but in reality, nobody wants to go, but they all end up going to Abilene anyway. This commenter is basically saying, let's teach kids that they only need to go to confession if it's really, really, really serious because no one really wants to go. That's the bottom line, what this commenter seems to be wanting to say here. So I replied thusly. Disclaimer, I'm not a priest. That said, the sacrament of reconciliation isn't just about the absolution of sin. It confers many graces upon the penitent as well, including strengthening the soul against the temptation to commit that sin again. Parenthetical comments, I also linked to an article on Aletheia and the National Catholic Register. My comments continue. The other issue is one of judgment. Who is the better judge of the gravity of the sin, the sinner, or the priest in the confessional? How likely is the sinner to employ moral relativism and listen to the whispers of the enemy saying, it's not that serious, when in fact it is? Too often, the sacrament of reconciliation is only available for an hour on Saturdays. Worse, in some parishes, it's by appointment. Our parish now offers Saturdays, Wednesday nights, and before every Mass. We didn't always. Another parish I go to sometimes offers it after every daily Mass, until done. There's always a line at both parishes. Thanks be to God. So another Anon comes back with this. I am aware of your line of arguments. I'll address them as best I can. The priest in the confessional would be the first to tell you that they can't always see into the heart. We all agree on the serious and obvious mortal sins need confessing. But those sins are generally deeply disturbing to the penitent anyway. Mortal sin creates a complete cutoff of our relationship with God. God willing, most people are feeling that by the time they finally get there. The priest can't know what they are feeling, although they could spot scrupulosity, another hazard of advocating for regular confession. The sacrament cannot confer more access than what would already come from a sincere and contrite heart. Remember, sacraments are only outward signs of the grace conferred. Sacraments do not confer extra grace in that sense that quite often advocates suggest. It may be to overcome an addiction or some other serious matter that the repeated use of sacraments required. However, in the case of venial sins, there's no extra spiritual points by confessing unnecessarily. There's an unfortunate streak of turning God into an accountant at times, and this is one area where it can show up. It also suggests a lack of trust and prayer in God's mercy. The last thoughts presented was what I was warning directly against. Confession is about sin, and more importantly, very serious sin. It's a very good thing that many people don't need to confess each week. My understanding is that the early church would throw people out for confessing more than once or twice in a lifetime. I don't think we need to go back to that. I do think attempting to measure either priests or congregations by how often people confess is deeply unwise. A practicing Catholic shouldn't even need the once-a-year confession theoretically, if in good spiritual health. So here is where I get a little ticked off, because the links I provided refuted major points of their I know better diatribe. So after a brief and somewhat snarky recognition of that, I proceeded to do what is my default in situations like this and break out the fact hammer and start pounding away. So here's my reply. Someone didn't read the links I shared, apparently, so rather than give links, I'll quote verbatim. Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 1458, quote, without being strictly necessary, confession of everyday faults, venial sins, is nevertheless strongly recommended by the Church. Indeed, the regular confession of our venial sins helps us form our conscience, fight against evil tendencies, let ourselves be healed by Christ, and progress in the life of the Spirit. End quote. St. John Paul II, who went to confession every week, frequent confession is a training in holiness. St. Teresa of Avila, without frequent confession, the soul becomes weak. St. Ignatius of Loyola required Jesuits to go to confession weekly. St. Philip Neri, the best way to advance in virtue is to go frequently to confession. St. Francis de Sales, frequent confession is the best means of purifying the soul. go to confession frequently, even if you have no mortal sin? Do you have any proof that the early church dissuaded confession more than a few times in a lifetime? If you don't have receipts, I'm going to reject it on its face. Are you saying that when the priest, acting in persona Christi in the confessional, isn't granted the grace, as God wills it, to read the soul of the penitent? While most priests can't see into the penitent's heart, there are some who can. St. John Vianney and St. Padre Pio were well known for this. As for the rest of your reply, I could address things point by point to show you where you were in error, but I'd be tempted to say things that, even though you're anonymous, would send me to the confessional. So another Anon replied with a long diatribe that basically restated their original argument without offering anything new for all intents and purposes, and they doubled down, as it were, and clearly cast aside the explicit teaching of the church in favor of their own moral relativistic view that can best be summed up as, you only need to go to confession if it's really, really bad. Most people go to confession to look holy. There's no added benefit in going frequently, and since most sins are trivial, you can simply pray and ask for forgiveness, and poof, you're forgiven. Now, in my old age, when dealing with people online who actually want to remain anonymous and not have a real conversation, I tend to get rankled like St. Jerome. I become curmudgeonly, especially when people think that they know better than the magisterium and the saints. And while I've cooled off enough to not give the great name caller St. Jerome a run for his money, I'm going to be as direct as possible with you, the Saint in Progress audience, because if you're listening to the show, you, like me and the other listeners, are making efforts to be holy, not just look holy. So here's my take on this anonymous poster's comments. This line of thinking makes a mockery of not just the sacrament of confession, but it makes a mockery of Father Anthony Gerber, the priest who wrote the original article, and every priest who is a true shepherd who cares about his flock and wants more people into the confessional so that he can help save the sick and ailing sheep. It also makes a mockery of those people who, with great humility and conviction of heart, stand in the confessional lines to bare their hearts to the Almighty for every fault, no matter how small, because they know that every sin, no matter how small, is still offensive to God. And now that I got that out of my system, here's what I did. There's a great examination of conscience based on the virtues that I pulled together from various sources. I made it into a PDF and made it available for free. If you're already a Substack subscriber or a subscriber to the mailing list at CatholicTreehouse.com, you'll be getting a separate email with a download link. If you're not subscribed, then here's what you do. Either go to CatholicTreehouse.com and at the bottom of the homepage, sign up for the email list, or go to CatholicTreehouse.substack.com and subscribe there. The examen is 3 pages long and it focuses on the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, and the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Now, if you do a little bit of math here, 3 plus 4 equals 7 for those virtues, and there are 7 days of the week. So if you want, one way of doing this examen is to assign a different virtue to each day of the week, and every night do an examen of the virtue of the day. And at the end, it has a traditional act of contrition prayer and a prayer written by St. Gemma Galgani. It's a beautiful prayer that I really like, and I use it for my act of contrition, and I hope you like it too. Okay, so Lent starts on Wednesday, February 18th, so while you shouldn't wait for a special occasion like Lent to go to confession, it's always good to start this penitential season with a good confession, and I hope this examen helps with that. Okay, thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to check out What Are We Looking For? Honor Thy Wife, and the new and updated Saint Challenge, 2nd edition, and all the other great books we offer at CatholicTreehouse.com. And if you're in the Central Ohio area, be sure to check out the Catholic Treehouse table at the Columbus Catholic Men's Conference and Columbus Catholic Women's Conference. The Women's Conference is next weekend, February 21st, and the Men's Conference is the following weekend, February 28th. So be sure to stop by and say hi at the Men's Conference. Michael Hayek and Kevin Lowry will both be at my table signing copies of their books. And of course, I'll have some fabulous new rosaries available as well. There's also a bunch of new books coming out, and I'm very excited about. So be sure to subscribe either to this podcast over at Substack. Again, that's CatholicTreehouse.substack.com, where you can also support us with a paid subscription, or go to catholictreehouse.com and subscribe to the mailing list. Either way, when you do, you'll get that free PDF download link of the examination of conscience based on the virtues. So as always, love God and neighbor, get to confession, and stay in a state of sanctifying grace. Pray your rosary, pray for the salvation of souls, especially all those who have fallen away from the faith. And you know what? Pray for that anonymous respondent to Father Gerber's post on Substack. Just pray for them to have their heart opened to the truth about the mercy that is available for them and for all of us in the sacrament of confession. And most of all, remember, my friends, that you are a saint in progress, so go out there and be a saint.